Hello, everyone. Today, I'm glad to have John from Christianity on the Spectrum podcast with me in the Yours Truly virtual studio. A few weeks ago, Tense Before Temples author and regular participant of this little corner of the internet, Michael Sartori, tagged me on a post on X from Christianity on the Spectrum, who was looking to go on podcasts and talk about their podcast and project. I thought this sounded interesting, and I reached out for the conversation. Recently, Michael shared his journey into learning he had autism, and Jordan Hall has also shared this in his conversation with Paul Vanderklay. I also would hypothesize that there are many others in the corner who share this as part of their story as well, related to the nature of deep and hyper-focused learning of things like philosophy and theology. So maybe this could be helpful furthering a conversation here in the corner. But first, give the video a like and subscribe for the vanity metrics. And if you believe in the work of yours truly, consider becoming a channel member to support it financially. Members get early podcast previews and personal updates about the channel and what's going on inside of my mind, thanks to all the yours truly faithful already out there. Christianity on the Spectrum has a YouTube channel linked below whose channel description reads, "This podcast is the summation of around 9 years of research into autistic Christian and ex-Christian sub-communities, covering over 26,000 online autistics with interviews with over 450 Christian and ex-Christian autistics. This podcast is trying to explain how autistic people interact with Christianity, the good, the bad, and everything in between." And John's X profile reads as follows: "John from Christianity on the Spectrum podcast, both Christian and autistic, red team and IR, veteran of the cyber wars." We'll see what that's all about. I'm excited to connect with John today and learn and share more about his work with the Christianity on the Spectrum podcast and hear about how he survived the cyber wars. All this today as we practice some conversation craft here on the Yours Truly podcast, a place we go to think out loud. So without any further delay, I give you John from Christianity on the Spectrum. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. John, welcome.
Hey, glad to be here.
Yeah, man. So the internet's a fun place to play. I've been playing around on YouTube and stuff for a little over a year now. And, you know, when you're building something, it's like, oh, there's somebody else who's wanting to play a little bit. And that's kind of what happened on Twitter, it seemed like, with Michael kind of answering your call on these questions. So glad to have you here today. There's kind of a little bit of a tradition in this kind of corner of the internet to start conversations out. One of the questions that seems to go a long way is to tell us about the home you grew up in, man.
Okay, yeah. So I grew up in Canada, rural Saskatchewan, kind of middle of nowhere, on a farm. Dad's a teacher, mom's a microbiologist, specializes in virology. Had three other siblings. Yeah, and kind of grew up there, working on the farm, doing all those sorts of things. Was always really interested in history and computers, and yeah, kind of just got into computer engineering and joined the army at age 18, and that shipped me off outside of Saskatchewan, and so that's kind of where I grew up, and sort of relevant to this conversation. So I found out around age 12. I was like, okay, I always felt like I didn't really connect with anyone, couldn't really socially integrate, figured there's got to be something wrong with me, don't know what it is. And for a very long time, I just didn't know what to call it other than the fact that I felt like I was a sort of alien transplanted into human culture and had to figure it out like a sort of alien anthropologist trying to understand it. And then at 16, a family friend of ours basically came and did an assessment with me and said, "You're one of the most typical cases of Asperger's syndrome that exists." And so I learned I was autistic at age 16, and then just kind of went from there. So I was raised Mennonite, brethren. Mennonites, famously pacifists. So I don't think it stuck too well because I joined the army at age 18. But I mean, the joke with Mennonite brethren is MB stands for mostly Baptist, and so like essentially the reason that my family went to a Mennonite brethren church wasn't because we were super into being Mennonite, but mostly because I was the closest thing to conservative evangelical. So that's kind of like the home I grew up in. My dad is also on the spectrum as well, also very, very similar to me. My mom probably also is, and one of my other siblings probably is. And so
you said there were how many siblings?
3.
Yeah. So there's what is how connected to Asperger's, or I guess, is that even what's used anymore? I'm not familiar.
No. So that was the term that was used when I was first diagnosed. So back in the DSM-4, so the Diagnostic Statistic Manual version 4, we had various different types of autism. So you had Asperger's syndrome, you had high functioning autism, you had low functioning autism. And then when DSM-5 came out, so that's the newest version of the DSM, they basically took all those terms and put them under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. And so now we have autism 1, autism 2, autism 3, 1 being the place where I am, so and probably the place where you interact with most other autistic people. So like Michael and Jordan Hall, they're also autism 1. So autism 1 just means low support needs. Autism 2, high support needs, and autism 3, like very high support needs or very substantial support needs. And so, all my research is focused on autism 1, mostly just because it's way easier to find and interact, and just the convenience of doing it. And that's really where my specialty is. So everything I do is focused on autism 1. So yeah. At the time, though, it was called Asperger's syndrome, and you'll probably hear people call themselves Aspies and things like that. And that's basically just because back before, I think it was 2014, it was just called Asperger's syndrome, and that's what most of us had. But there was also high functioning autism, and the only difference between Asperger's and high functioning autism was people with high functioning autism had delayed speech acquisition. But after like once you become an adult, there was functionally no difference between a person with high functioning autism and Asperger's. So it's like, why are we even making this distinction? Like the only difference was like one of you spoke before the age of 5 and one of you didn't. Like that's not a really useful label to have for adults anymore. So
and I guess, in the general culture, I remember watching even like movies in the late like 2000s, early 2010s, and Asperger's was actually like used in pop culture movies. And I know that, and then there was some point, like you said, I guess when DSM-5 came out, that has shifted. And I think that's helpful to kind of like, okay, what happened here? What's the little storyline, on that. But so you say you've got possibly 1 or 2 of your siblings as well. You assume maybe you're pretty sure your dad is, possibly your mom. How much?
I know for a fact my dad is. Like it's so obvious.
How much of it is genetic, or a lot of people? There's the big conversation, that the controversial one about vaccines and autism, and like, what's your understanding of all that?
Yeah, so the best predictor of whether or not you will be autistic is whether you have autistic people in your family. And that's just like across the board, the best data that we can have. Vaccines causing autism is a very long, controversial history, and it's controversial for a reason. And one of the reasons is the data isn't actually particularly good. There's correlation, but not causation. And like, you can find correlations with virtually anything, right? But there hasn't been any causative link shown. Andrew Wakefield, who was the guy who like really pushed that, he was pushing it mostly because he had a vaccine patent that didn't use a certain component in it. And so he basically said, okay, this like thimerosal mercury, this is what causes autism. But he had a patent for a vaccine that didn't have it in. And like his data sampling was extremely biased. It was a really hack job. Like people try to make him out to be a martyr, but he wasn't a martyr. He was just bad at his job, basically, and has unfortunately started a lot of autism misinformation that people cling to. But the reality is, from all the data that we have, and we have a lot of data on this, the best predictor of whether or not you will be autistic is if you have a family history of autism. There is an extremely strong genetic component. And in fact, one of the ways that I find most people over the age of 30 get diagnosed is they have a child that gets diagnosed with autism. And then when their child gets diagnosed, they realize they also have it as well. And so, we talk about this explosion in autism rates, but the explosion in the autism rates is actually really easily understood once you just understand how the diagnosis of autism has shifted since 1990. So Asperger's wasn't really a thing until like 1993-ish. And even then it was still very, very niche. And then we didn't even think girls could get it, or we thought girls were extremely rare, like girls were one in maybe 10 or one in 20, the estimates were. And then we just realized actually girls and boys are just different, and they present differently, and they socialize differently. And so when you have a social disability like autism, of course it's going to affect things, right? So that's basically expanding diagnostic criteria is largely responsible for the increase of autism. Increased screening as well. Like now we know what to look for. So like guys like my dad would never have been diagnosed because they just weren't looking for it, and they didn't know what it was at the time. And so by the time he was an adult and he'd figured everything out, he didn't really need a diagnosis, and there was no reason for him to get a diagnosis. But now we just look for it more, especially we look for it in schools. We have better screening. We are better able to detect it in girls now than we were before, and we know what it looks like in girls now when before we really didn't.
What's an example of a difference?
Yeah, so girls are significantly better at socially adapting than boys. And so boys will often be very, very bad at social conformity, have a lot of trouble fitting in, and also just the way the boys are taught to react to social situations versus the way girls are taught to react to social situations and things like that, that changes social expression, right? And so boys will tend to be very weird, and like you'll notice it immediately, where girls will be weird within normal parameters. And so you'll typically see things like that. Boys will often be hypo-emotional and hypo-emotionally sensitive, so significantly less emotionally sensitive. Like people kind of joke that we're like robots, like Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory is like a sort of archetypal autistic male. Whereas often autistic girls can be hyper emotional, where they're extremely emotionally sensitive and things just go off like that. But, also you have men and boys who present with autism that looks a lot closer to what it does in a typical girl. And you'll have girls who have autistic expressions that look closer to what it's typically like in boys. And so there isn't like a
100%
harsh delineating line between the two sexes. It's more just like a sort of bimodal distribution.
So what with the quote unquote explosion of autism, what probably is more of the round percentage of, I don't know, American population or North American population or what, Western?
Yeah, it's really hard to tell is the short answer, and it's really hard to tell for a lot of reasons, and it's mostly due to sampling and how we sample. And so I'm a researcher. This is my bread and butter, and like I know how hard it is to correctly sample things. And it's also hard to sample in certain communities that are just wildly undersampled. So estimates range from anywhere between 1 in 100 to 1 in 33.
Wow.
So it's somewhere within that range, and the ratio of boys to girls is probably closer to like 1 to 1.5, or maybe 1 to 1. We're not entirely sure, but it's, when we thought it was 1 girl for every 10 boys, it's probably closer to 1 girl for every 1.5 boys, or maybe even 1 to 1. We just don't have particularly good information about it because it's only been like 10 years since we've really been making a conscious effort to ensure that we don't miss girls on the autism spectrum. And girls are usually much later diagnosed than boys. And so there are all sorts of like sampling issues, because if you only take diagnostic data from elementary school, you're going to miss a lot of girls in that, because girls will often not present with symptoms that make sure they get screened or assessed, right? Because what gets you in the screening and assessment pipeline? It's dysfunctional behavior and failure to socially integrate and things like that, and like difficulties. And so if those difficulties don't really show up until you're like a 14-year-old girl, but you're only sampling data from like elementary schools, that's gonna mess up your percentages. And so the long answer is it's very hard to tell what the actual numbers are, but they are probably between 1 in 30 to 1 in 100, somewhere in there.
So obviously more than what was previously assumed, but then
it was previously assumed to be 1 in 10,000.
Wow.
And so like,
is that for each? Is that combining all the levels 1 through, I think he's 4? Yeah. So
1 through 3. Yeah.
Oh, 3. Sorry. So you mentioned social disability, and obviously the higher number that you have, the more disabled someone is from social interaction. But I mean, for yourself, like in your story, you said at 12 you've kind of realized I feel different than, or I feel like a fish out of water all the time.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it held you back from something like that? There was a disabling reality that you existed in?
Oh, definitely.
Could you describe that?
Yeah. So one of the ways that autism is typically described, at least Autism 1, is it's like being in a play where you feel like everyone else has a script and you don't have a script, and you just don't understand what's going on. I didn't realize that people's voice tone was communicating different information to me. I would just take the literal words they were saying and not account for tone and voice. So I was really bad at understanding sarcasm. People say like 80% of communication is nonverbal or something like that, and I'm missing like 70% of that nonverbal communication, right?
Okay.
And so when you're going through that, you just miss a lot of what people are saying. You don't understand when people like you or don't like you, and it's especially when you're a human in a human society and you're very socially connected to each other. If you are missing those social cues, it's just it's going to cause a lot of problems, and it's going to cause a lot of issues. Sorry. And then there are also other issues of like, I was hyper fixated on various topics, and that's something autistic people get a lot. It's like,
what were some of them? What were some we were
getting? So the first one was the Bismarck, which was a German battleship in the Second World War. Loved the Bismarck, loved everything about the Bismarck in a way that no 6-year-old should. So like I was like drawing out its like movement patterns in first grade to like explain to my teacher how the Bismarck was moving and where it got attacked at various points and where it sunk, because like I was just really into it. And then I was really interested in the siege of Stalingrad when I was like in grade 5 to 7, and I literally like just borrowed books from the library, like huge books on the siege of Stalingrad, and just read them all the time. That's like the movie Enemy at the Gates had come out, and my dad let me watch it with him. And that just I was obsessed for years with it.
So it makes sense of wanting to go into the armed forces, that was more part of your development.
I've always loved military history. It was a big, huge interest of mine. And then when I kind of got to age 12-ish, I got really into computers, and I was really good at math and really good at sort of like the technical side of things.
How old are you?
I'm 32.
So we're talking about like mid 90s, like late 90s computers. Is that what you're talking about?
So like late 90s, early 2000s. And especially hacking. So I learned about how you could modify your own computer games so that you could like get more money in your game and things like that. And that sort of got me really interested in realizing this is not a magic box. This is a deterministic math machine. And if I can just get really good at understanding how all these pieces fit together, I can manipulate it to get it to do what I want. And so like I started hacking at age 12, and I was really, really good at it and got very, very good. Went to a whole bunch of robotics competitions, was really involved in computer science club, built a whole bunch of things that I probably shouldn't have been building when I was a teenager, doing a bunch of things, going places that I probably shouldn't have been going. And yeah, so basically when I turned 17-ish, I wanted to go to join the army and be an army officer and study military history. And my mother sat me down and said, okay, I'm just gonna break this down for you. If you do military history, your career options are limited to like that, right? If you do computer engineering, your career options are much larger. Your earning potential is going to be much higher. And it is way better for you to be a computer engineer with an interest in military history than a military historian with an interest in computers. And then so she told me, like, you need to do computer engineering. And so I did computer engineering, and I initially was in the combat engineers. When I joined the military, that was my trade. But pretty much the first year that I was in the military, in military college, there was a lack of signals officers, so communications and electronics guys in the military, and they did a presentation, and then my squad comm, like my squadron commander, took me aside and said, "Look, John, I know you're a combat engineer. I know you want to be a combat engineer, but listen, you were built for signals. Like, you are the guy. You are like, whenever someone looks on the box to see what the ideal signals officer is, it's you. Please join signals." So he was also a signals officer.
How many, I mean, how many computer, back when we had human computers, for NASA, and like, just how much of intellectual horsepower and code breaking and all this stuff. I mean, the percentage that most of those people were autists is like probably,
so
90 something percent.
Huge. Like, so I'll give you an example. So after I finished my university degree, that's when Canada was really trying to ramp up its cyber force capabilities. And so I was basically identified in university as one of the guys, and then pushed into the cyber warfare pipeline. And so I led a squad of other guys. I was a troop commander.
What can you tell us about the cyber warfare pipeline?
Not much. So it was based out of the Royal Military College of Canada, which is sort of like Canada's West Point. With the computer security lab, I was one of the guys in it. There's a great master's degree program that I did. And yeah, so in it, I would say probably half of us were either known on the autism spectrum or should have been known on the autism spectrum. And so like it's like ubiquitous in that field, or pretty much any high technology field or high technical skill field, you'll find an enormous amount of us there. And
specialists, hyper specialized.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, this gives people the wrong impression that all autistic people are really good at math. Some of us are, like, I'll admit, like, I'm sort of the walking stereotype in that respect, but there are many autistic people who are bad at math.
You're probably good at art, different art.
Yes. But like brilliant artists, or like really good at doing other sorts of skills and tasks and things like that. A lot of really skilled tradespeople who are like carpenters, mechanics, welders, who just sort of take that hyper focus energy and just push it into something else. But yeah, you'll wherever you find like sort of extremes, you tend to find disproportionate amounts of autistic people in those extremes.
So this maybe is all begging the question of why Christianity on the spectrum? Because we touched on you were raised like Mennonite Brethren and kind of Baptist evangelical. Like, where does that intersect in the story?
Yeah, so very shortly after going to university, I deconstructed. I just started evaluating the claims that Christianity was making and found them lacking, to put it mildly.
What year was that?
It would have been in the early 2010s.
Okay.
And so it was like sort of the height of the new atheist movement. And so I, was seeing what they were saying, hearing their arguments, and found their arguments way more convincing than the Christian apologists. So I deconverted, and I didn't really think about it at all with respect to autism. I just figured I just did it because it was smart. Like, this is just, of course I did it. It makes sense to deconvert. This is obviously not true. Sorry. I just thought this is obviously not true. And then 3 years later, after I deconverted, I was invited to a group of autistic people meetups with Queen's University. So Queen's University is co-located near the Royal Military College. They're both in Kingston, Ontario, very close to each other. And there was a meetup for autistic guys. Well, not guys. It was all guys, but it just autistic people. And I talked to a whole lot of them, and I found a lot of them had the same story to me, like a very similar story. Like, we're like, oh yeah, I was raised evangelical and now I'm an atheist. And I was like, this is kind of weird, right? That it happened so many times to so many people who had never spoken to each other at all, who had just met, and we almost all have the same story. And I'm like, I wonder why that is. So I went online and I looked through all the peer-reviewed research that I could find, and I found it lacking, to put it lightly. Autism is one of those things where, especially when you get to autism and religion, most people either really understand autism and don't understand religion, or don't understand religion but really understand autism, or whatever the combo is. You almost never get a person who really understands religion and really understands autism. And so I was reading through a lot of the papers, and what the papers were basically saying is autistic people are way less likely than their neurotypical counterparts to be Christian. And I thought, all right, cool. Why is that? And then I read their answers, and I thought, these answers are very dumb. Like, this is not my experience. This is not how it worked. So I thought, I'm going to figure it out myself. And at the time, I was really into understanding the New Testament and early Christianity. So that was sort of my special interest, or my hyperfixation throughout university. And that's like the reason I deconverted, is because I got really into New Testament scholarship, basically. Yeah. And just found there was the narratives I was raised with in a very conservative evangelicalism, and the stuff I was reading in scholarship just wasn't adding up. And I thought the scholarship is far more intellectually robust than the apologetics that I was reading, and that's basically why I deconverted. But I thought, this is a really interesting project, and this is something that I know a lot about. And not only that, this is something that I have a sort of unique set of skills to do. I have all the right checks in all the right boxes, and I am really, really good at writing code. And so I basically thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write data scrapers to go through social media, Reddit, basically wherever autistic people are found, and just scrape all their data from the internet, throw it in a database, and then read it if they talk about Christianity or if they talk about religion. And so I did mass data collect on basically any public social media post I could find, any blog run by an autistic person, if they talked about religion, and just collected and collated all this data and started analyzing it. And I realized, this is actually a really complicated narrative, and there aren't any like silver bullets here. There aren't any easy answers. And I started to be like, I really want to drill down into this much deeper than I currently have. And I found I just wasn't getting the level of depth that I wanted from doing passive data collect, right? Because when you're just reading what other people post, you can't really ask them to clarify points that they've posted. And sometimes they're really precise, and sometimes they get all the answers that you want in like a very, very long blog post. Autistic people are kind of notorious for posting huge walls of text on things. And so I basically just started reaching out to these people and being like, hey, do you want to do a long form interview about your experiences with Christianity or your experiences leaving Christianity? And sometimes they would say yes. And so I just started doing these interviews, and then I just kept refining my research process, and I really wasn't planning on publishing any of this information, because in the section of the military it's like I was in SIG and Cyber. You don't talk about what you're doing. If people know who you are, that's like an issue. So I was never planning on going public with it. It was just a hobby of mine, basically. It was something that I found really interesting. And then in 2020, I left the military. I got out of the military, and I ended up reconverting to Christianity. And so I've come back to Christianity. I'm an Anglican now, and I sort of just started going, okay, I have this huge amount of information, which could be extremely useful for a lot of people, because one of the things that you get when you survey a lot of autistic people is it's just like misery, desperation, and sadness, basically, when they're interacting with Christianity. A lot of confusion, a lot of, I don't get why everyone else gets this and I don't. And I just thought, I have so much data. I can put words to your frustration, and I can explain your frustrations with like actual data, which is something autistic people love, right? Like you don't just give them vibes. You say, these are the numbers, right? And I thought I could do this. So pandemic hit.
That sounds a little bit like Doge to me.
Yeah.
Just give them vibes, give them numbers.
Yeah. So I was like, you're gonna get the numbers. So I started writing a book, and I got to the end of writing a book, and then by the time I hit the end, I was like, I need to rewrite this whole thing, because as I was writing, I was like clarifying my thoughts and everything, and I was like, I need to rewrite this, and so I rewrote it, and then I rewrote it again, same thing, and then I thought, I'm not great at writing books. I should not do this, and so I thought, you know what I can do though? I was an army officer for 10 years. I can do a PowerPoint presentation like no one's business. So I was like, I can do this in presentation form and in podcast form. So I called up another autistic person who I knew had some experience talking about autism and Christianity from her perspective as an autistic woman. And I thought, great, Amy, do you want to do this with me? And she said yes. And so I basically took my 10 years of research and I crammed it into 10 episodes of a podcast. And then people started asking lots of questions. And now I'm just doing Q&A episodes, answering whatever questions I get. And that's sort of what the podcast is. So there's basically 2 questions in it. The first question is, why are autistic people less likely to be Christian? Just like what is the reason that we're less likely to be Christian and to engage with Christianity? And then the next question is, okay, the ones that don't leave Christianity, what does their Christianity actually look like? And does it differ from a general practice of Christianity?
So
and
before we go to that PowerPoint presentation, can we hear about your story, like your story back into Christianity?
Oh yeah. So I did 3 podcast episodes on this.
So if you want to hear about his story, go to the podcast.
Yeah, if you want the long version, and that's not even the long version. That's the edited, redacted short version. I cut like 4 hours out of that.
Wow.
So I'll try to give you the very short version. So I'll just say I have found the sort of apologetics industrial complex deeply unconvincing and deeply frustrating. I was not convinced by, this one weird new argument for the resurrection or anything like that. The very short answer to it is I started to do a lot of work in forensic reconstruction. So my background is digital forensics and incident response, and offensive cybersecurity, specializing in counter forensics. So my job is to mess with forensics guys, or that was sort of my specialist. That's what I did my master's in, is messing with the forensic teams to make it so that they could do everything right. They could go through this methodological reconstruction process, and I would set the conditions so that they would always come to wrong answers. And it's very complicated. It's extremely technical, and it takes a very long time to explain why. But basically, I got extremely into forensic reconstructive methodology and how it works and what you can say and what you can't say and the way that you can say things and how you can say things and what conclusions you can draw from data sets and what conclusions you can't draw from data sets. And a lot of that work made me have to rethink my relationship to a lot of New Testament scholarship, where I started going, you guys are doing what I'm doing, but you're doing it on 2,000-year-old data that is way, way, way worse than the data that I have in terms of like quality, quantity, fidelity, all that stuff. And you are making really bold proclamations that I could never make in my modern context with my much better data set. And it sort of made me reevaluate a lot of critical scholarship and when someone says something like, well, the pastorals, Paul didn't write those. I go, I do forensic attribution. Like, this is one of the big things that I do, where I take things that people wrote and try to attribute that to the person who wrote them. And I look at that scholarship and I go, this method doesn't work to do the thing that you think it does. I've actually had to do the data science on this. I know what you should be able to expect and what sorts of conclusions you should be able to draw from this data. And you cannot draw the conclusion that Paul didn't write this. That, like, you can't draw the conclusion that he did write it, but you also can't draw the conclusion that he didn't write it. And so a lot of my, I guess, like, Bart Ehrman,
I was waiting for that name.
High criticism, New Testament scholarship, skepticism, analysis, I had to reevaluate that. And I had to reevaluate what my relationship to these texts would be. And what my relationship to the text changed was from, I know what these are. I know what the conclusions you can draw from them are, to a sort of, these are documents from the early church, and that's about as far as you can go back with it. And the question is basically, then how do you respond to those?
Yeah.
And
what kind of trust can you, your relationship related to trust with them?
And why should you respond to them? And in what ways should you respond to them? And how, now that I'm rethinking my sort of critical evaluation of these texts, what do I do? And it's a great question. And I got really into two or three thinkers. So the first one is Wilfred Owen. So Wilfred Owen was a British officer in the First World War, very Anglican, died in the First World War, and wrote a lot of war poetry. He's very famous for poems like Dulce et Decorum Est, which is the poem is about watching a man die in a gas attack. And the phrase Dulce et Decorum Est pro patria mori means it is a sweet and fitting thing to die for your country. And he titles the poem Dulce et Decorum Est, and he says, actually, this is what war is like. And he ends the poem saying, if you could watch what I just watched, you wouldn't tell schoolboys the old lie, Dulce et Decorum Est pro patria mori. And so he was very brutal and upfront about what war was like and what the mental cost of war was. He has another poem called Mental Cases about watching people in a British field hospital suffering with PTSD. And another one about called Self-Inflicted Wound, or SIW, about a soldier shooting himself. And it's very brutal, but it's also deeply Christian. And there was a lot of stuff that I had to process from my military service, which unfortunately I can't really go into details at all. But suffice it to say, I found a lot of what he was saying deeply resonated with me. And I realized it deeply resonated with me in a way that wouldn't resonate with me had it not been Christian. And that Wilfred Owen's Christianity and his critique of war and what was happening in the wars was so intrinsically tied to his Christianity that I couldn't extricate the two. Like, I couldn't separate the two. And I was like, okay, why does this resonate with me so much? And eventually, like, that didn't convert me to Christianity or anything. It just made me open to and sympathetic to Christianity in a way that I hadn't really been before. And then there was another person who I know comes up a lot in this corner, René Girard.
Mm-hmm.
So I read a lot of Girard, mostly because I was having an argument with my friend about another messianic figure from the 2nd century called Apollonius of Tyana, and we were having an argument about him because he's sort of he's like a pagan parallel to Jesus in many ways, probably written as a pagan parallel to Jesus in many ways. And I was like, well, what's the difference? And he said, you should read this book called I See Satan Fall Like Lightning by René Girard. And in that book, Girard makes explicit comparisons between the sort of functional differences between Jesus and his message versus the message of Apollonius of Tyana. And I went, ooh, hadn't thought about that before. And then I just got really into Girard. I'm not a Girardian, but I did appreciate his work for what it is. And it also opened me up to Christianity in a way that I hadn't before. And I started going like, okay, maybe there is something going on here that I hadn't previously thought of. You know, maybe I had missed some things in my sort of new atheist skepticism era, and there were things I was overlooking and things I just wasn't able to see. And then also just I was very into Sam Harris as a very big Sam Harris guy, and then slowly getting disillusioned with Sam Harris when I started to do things that he talked about a lot. And then I started to get into those fields, specifically like him talking about Islamic extremism. And it's like, you know, my era was sort of ISIS, war in Syria, that sort of thing, and then stuff going on in Africa and North Africa. And I just found his analysis was lacking, to say the least, and his understanding of the conflicts was very naive, and the overall analysis I found was just bad. And I thought, okay, if he could get this wrong, what else might he have gotten wrong? And then so that all those factors sort of opened me to Christianity in a way that I hadn't previously been open to hearing about it. And then I read Simone Weil. And Simone Weil is a French philosopher from the sort of mid-early 20th century. And she wrote a lot about Christianity. And I also think we have more than enough biographical information about her and stories about her life to say she was probably autistic. And she talked about Christianity in a way that I had not heard people talk about Christianity, and in a way that really deeply resonated with me, probably because it was just an autistic person describing Christianity, and I started deeply resonating with it. And I then read another book called This Way to the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, by a man named Tadeusz Borowski. And it was an account of his time at Auschwitz as a political prisoner and the sort of brutality and amorality. And in that book, there is a sub-essay called Auschwitz, Our Home. And in Auschwitz, Our Home, he goes through this very detailed critique of Nazi Germany and his relationship to Nazi Germany, and drawing parallels between him in the concentration camp and the slaves of antiquity. And he goes on this very long diatribe about antiquity being the conspiracy of free men against slaves and the orientation of the ancient world to its underclasses. And I thought, I've heard this before. Where have I heard this? And then I went, I know where I've heard this. Gregory of Nyssa and a bunch of other Christians. And I just started realizing in all these different ways, I am deeply resonating with Christianity and the things that Christians are saying. And at some point, I need to decide, just am I going to do it or not, right? Like, just make a decision and just do something. It's a very army attitude. Like, it's better to make a bad decision than no decision.
Yep.
And indecision and being indecisive is bad, basically. And I just decided, okay, I'm going to actually really try to do Christianity again. And I'm going to try to do it now with this huge amount of data that I had about how autistic people engage with and interact with Christianity in ways that are successful and ways that aren't. And I'm going to not bother with the ways that aren't, and I'm just going to focus on the ways that are, and I'm going to see if I can sort of develop a Christian practice that works for me. And I did, basically figured out a way to do it. And yeah, then I decided I should publish this podcast because it'd probably be useful for other people if they're interested in it.
So finding the Anglican Church, and also how do you reconcile like your kind of evangelical upbringing with you go full circle to new atheism, and then you're in philosophy and kind of like some existential intensities and dealing with the problem of evil and all that kind of stuff. Like, you obviously didn't land back in the evangelical church, but how do you kind of reconcile your past with like, how does that fit together for you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really resonate much with my past Christianity.
Yeah.
I think like what I'm doing would be virtually unrecognizable to like 12-year-old John. He would be like, what's going on? This doesn't make sense. There's a phenomenon within autistic people that I've documented, and like, actually you could build a mathematical relationship to express it. I call it high church drift. And so the high church drift is basically saying, as you age, if you are autistic and you stay within Christianity, the percentage chance that you will end up in a high church tradition increases as you age. And so basically past 35, it's pretty rare to find autistic people who aren't in high church traditions. And a lot of the Christianity I was raised with, I just don't really resonate with it at all. And not to say that I don't think it's Christian. I think it is Christian. It is a legitimate expression of the Christian faith. It's just not one that works particularly well for me. The way that I often talk about Christianity is I say there is no such thing as Christianity. There are Christianities, right? There are not to say that there isn't like a common core.
Have you heard of John Heer's movie coming out called Christianities?
No, I have not.
He's coming from the Orthodox kind of perspective, but he kind of hangs out in the corners of the internet that I do, in some, like with Symbolic World here with Jonathan Peugeot. And like, he's in the middle of producing a documentary actually called Christianities.
Yeah. And this basically it's not unique to me, right? Yeah. Like a lot of people say
I just think it's interesting. I think that's a good. I had a conversation with someone yesterday about identity related to like, what does it mean to say I'm a Christian? And I think it's something akin to what you're kind of aiming at with Christianities in a way.
Yeah. And so basically I look at the old way that I practice Christianity and go, that didn't work for me. And I don't think it ever will work for me. Like I've tried to make it work. I initially tried and I was just, this doesn't work. I can't go back to that. However, a sort of high church Anglo-Catholicism does work very well for me. So I'm in the sort of more conservative wing of the Anglican Church and the more high liturgical side of the Anglican Church. And that's where I find the expression of Christianity that I can actually understand and resonate with, because previous understandings, I can't grasp it really. Like, it doesn't functionally work for me. A lot of So one of the questions I asked autistic people when I was interviewing them is, what do you think of the idea of a personal relationship with Jesus?
Yep, I
And
was gonna ask you about that.
a lot of them were like, this is a confusing and incoherent concept to me. It was like 85%. So 15% say it works and I use it. And the remaining 85% go, I don't know what you're asking. To me, a personal relationship means someone I can talk to who talks back to me, like a tactile, I can talk to you, you can talk to me, we can have a conversation. I can't do that with God. How, like, what am I supposed to do? I often describe, like, I don't even know if I have a personal relationship with my wife, right? Like, the way that I understand relationships and social relationships is often so different from my peers, and the way that I conceptualize people. I often think of myself not as really engaging in a personal relationship, but sort of sitting at the control board of a nuclear reactor, watching the different levels and, like, you know, making adjustments to try and make sure it doesn't go into critical mode or things like that. And, like, I don't know how to do that with God. So
Yeah.
that works for me. That works for me really well.
So
And I
the
get a lot of
embodied
meaning out of it, but yeah.
the embodied, smells and bells, you can it's like a visible,
Yes.
your relationship to something that is visible and visceral, as
It's
opposed to,
visible. Yeah.
I sometimes call the lower church things like a little bit of Gnostic light, because it's literally like
Yes.
all inside of your head almost, because of the iconoclasm and
Yeah.
and uh and that it is just a relationship with something invisible. So,
Yeah.
that which, again, like, I understand certain parts about it. That was how I was raised, so, but I hear that high church drift, like you're talking about, and it's interesting to me. And I think people, like I talked about in the intro, that in this space, that's a big circular conversation about why orthodoxy, why high church, why liturgy, why all those things. And I think it does. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why people drift that direction, but specifically, like, within your work, and what does it mean to have a relationship to God and my religion or my faith? Like, I need more things that I
Yeah.
can grasp. And then
And
the
it,
highly emotive side of, like, charismania, like, or charismatic religions, is like, if emotive, even, a little bit of what I heard, the asking Jesus into your heart, and that type of language, or like, these songs about a love and a relationship, and those types of things, and people are having emotional, experiences around you that you already don't connect to in a
yeah.
neurotypical way. That makes sense of why there would be a drift, and why that would make so much more sense. Um,
Yeah. And, like, that's a huge thing. So a very, very common thing that happens with autistic people. I call it the universal autistic experience, as kind of a joke, because, or the universal autistic experience of Christianity. It's kind of a joke. It's not actually universal, but, it's near universal, where there comes a point in an autistic person's life when they go to an evangelical, like, praise and worship service, and the Holy Spirit's moving through the room and everyone's super into it, and you're sitting there looking around at everyone being like, what is going on? Like, what is wrong with these people? I don't understand it. I don't feel it. I'm not resonating with this. I don't get it. I don't get what's going on. And oftentimes you come to one of two conclusions: either there's something deeply wrong with me, or there's something wrong with everyone else, right? Like, either the Holy Spirit is here and it doesn't want me, or
mm,
this isn't the Holy Spirit, this is just all, like, made up.
that's a devastating
Yeah.
statement, and then
Yep.
the other. So, what are being involved in the high liturgics, and I don't know what kind of practices you personally do related to religion, but have you had more emotive connection in ways to your faith in recent years? Are there things that has drawn out of you, that in certain ways?
Yes, but not ecstatically,
Sure.
basically. So, like, I compare it to it's like very low and slow, to put it like that. It doesn't come out very theatrically. So a lot of autistic people also deal with something called alexithymia, which is something that I have a very high rate of, which is your ability to internally understand your own emotions. And alexithymia means you don't have a really good ability to conceptualize your own emotions and what you're feeling and how you're feeling it. And so for me, I do find emotional resonance with Christianity, but it's emotional resonance not along the lines of ecstatic emotional experience, but emotional resonance along the lines of intellectual connection is basically how I would put it.
And how does that relate
And
to I mean, I think evangelicalism is guilty of not wanting to bypass a lot of the ideas of suffering, and then you come to,
yeah,
when you mention Anglo-Catholicism, and you probably enjoy, or I don't know if enjoy, but appreciate the crucifix, and then
yeah,
related to everything that you talked to about all the books, those three kind of specific books that you read were all just about deep human suffering.
yes.
So yeah.
And Vey herself, she's famous for writing about affliction and the relation of, and affliction meaning non-redemptive suffering. So just suffering without meaning, suffering without purpose, and its relation to the cross and to crucifixion and all that type of thing. And I find that sort of thing resonates with me at some level. Like, again, it's not like I'm really emotional about it or ecstatic about it, but I feel a connection. Maybe solidarity is the right way to put it. I feel feelings of solidarity with Christ and with the Christians who have come before me. And I find the way that the liturgical services work allow me to experience that. Especially, like, I just appreciate about liturgical services how the central focal point of the service is the Eucharist, not the sermon, right? And so in evangelical churches, it's often the sermon, and if the sermon is bad, it's like, well, this sucks, I went to an evangelical church, and the pastor was talking about something that I knew a lot about. And I was like, "Ooh, you're getting a lot of this stuff wrong." Like, he was trying to explain Marxism, and I'm like, "No, that's not what Marxism is. You don't understand it. That sucks." But anyway, so you go to a service, and if the sermon sucks, it's kind of a wash. But with a liturgical service and a lot of the high church services, the central part is the Eucharist, and the central part is the participation in the Eucharist with all these other Christians simultaneously participating in it. And bringing all that together, I find emotionally satisfying in a way that it's very hard for me to articulate exactly what is going on there. But there is something going on there that I deeply resonate with. And is it just the ritual and the repetition and all these other things that autistic people are inherently drawn to?
Oh, that's interesting.
Maybe. but also I think there is a emotionally satisfying intellectual component that has to do with solidarity that I find deep resonance with. And a lot of autistic people in their faith often don't talk about personal relationship with Jesus, but solidarity and suffering, compassion, these types of things, and understanding and awareness of these types of things. And that usually focuses quite heavily in autistic spirituality and autistic spiritual practice. But yeah, I don't do ecstatic verbal spontaneous prayer. I pretty much I'm Anglican, so I have the Book of Common Prayer. I just use that. I'm not really good at doing verbal spontaneous prayer. It doesn't click for me, and it doesn't click for a lot of autistic people, but it really clicks for me to read prayers that other people have written and go, yes, I resonate with this part of it. So yeah.
I think it's interesting to think about the future of, but even for evangelicalism, to the work that you're doing, which I want to kind of shift more to the podcast, like how that could actually help, the conversation between these different parts of Christianity to share the gifts that each one of them has with one another. And it sounds like what is kind of, I don't know if we hit on this exactly, but kind of what is your aim with the podcast? What is kind of like the major aim that you're aiming at?
Yeah. So the short sentence answer is to help autistic people. That's basically my goal with it, and to help autistic people understand what was going on with Christianity. So there are a bunch of things. I get a lot of messages from like ex-Christians or autistic people who have left the faith, who've listened to the podcast and been like, this has given me an enormous amount of relief, just knowing that I'm not the only one who had all these feelings and who went through this process, and to sort of give words to that. And a lot of the most people that reach out to me are autistic Christians who are still trying to do Christianity, but really struggling with it. And just learning that it's normal to struggle with it. And these are things that most autistic people have to go through. And like, you're not broken. Like, this isn't a you problem. This is a Christian expression problem that just isn't built with you in mind. And then also that, but there are ways of doing Christianity, and there are ways of doing Christianity that a lot of autistic people can do very easily. Like there's a phrase that often gets thrown about on the autistic internet whenever Christianity comes up, and it's something like Christianity is a religion by neurotypicals for neurotypicals. And what they're kind of expressing there is that Christianity, they didn't have me in mind when they made it. Like, the way that we practice it wasn't done with me in mind. No one understands my experiences. No one understands why I feel the way I do. No one really gets it. I can't talk to people about my actual feelings about it because they'll get mad at me if I'm honest, and all these things. And there are a lot of responses to that question. One of the responses is basically like, okay, buddy, like, read some church history. We've been here the whole time. Like, you can't get away from us. Like, we've been here since day zero. But also the more compassionate answer to that's probably the better one to say is, and I guess it's the theme of my podcast, is, yeah, it probably feels that way, but it doesn't have to be that way. Like, there's no set rule to say you need to keep trying to fit the square peg of your autism into the round hole of a particular Christian expression that doesn't work for you. Like, the whole point is to basically go, if you want it, there's a square hole just right over there. Just use the square hole. It'll be fine. Like, many other people have used the square hole and it works for them. So just like, stop trying to force the square peg into the round hole. Just use the round hole, or use the square hole or whatever. Yeah.
So, how long is the podcast? How long have you kind of been live with this and going on?
Yeah, since September, I've been publishing kind of weekly, bi-weekly, however it comes up. Done a lot of episodes. You know, autism is a really hot topic in a lot of places, and autism intersects with a lot of other really hot topics. And so sometimes I've had to take a lot more time to prepare an episode. So so for example, I did a large 3-parter on autism and gender, and autistic attitudes towards gender and gender identity and sexuality. And that, obviously, it's a really big thing because autistic people are disproportionately gay, bisexual, lesbian, trans, asexual, all that stuff. So like, when you look at the numbers of autistic people who are in those communities versus other places, we're wildly overrepresented. And that's for a whole bunch of reasons, but just, trying to explain those things as well. So it, and also just trying to answer people's questions that they have about various other things in autism. So I've been going since September, and mostly just trying to let other people know that this exists if they want to. And so for pastors or for clergy who are interested in learning about autism and what it is, I think it's a pretty good resource. But it's mostly for autistic people to help understand and contextualize their experiences with Christianity and why they are the way they are by just using a data-driven approach to answering the questions, and to say this is generally what the ground looks like, and this is where things come through. Like, I'm not a theologian, right? Like, I'm not particularly good at theology or very interested in theology. I'm mostly, like, my background's intelligence and military intelligence, and I see myself sort of as doing military intelligence, but for the church. Where I'm sort of saying this is what the state of the ground is. I don't care if you like that this is what the state of the ground is, but at some point someone needs to tell you this is what reality looks like, and this is what reality isn't. So this is what it is, this is what it isn't. Someone needs to kind of just sort of go through and try to accurately describe the ground as it exists, not as you want it to be. And so I see that as sort of my role with the podcast, and try to explain all that stuff.
You mentioned like covering dicey topics related to like sexual identity. Do you think you could have covered those 5 to 7 years ago? Do you think the landscape's changed on what's able to be talked about on the internet?
So it depends where, is basically the answer. So the way that I address the topic is a very like data-centric approach. So I probably could have done this 7 years ago, mostly because I try very hard not to make prescriptive statements, just to make descriptive statements. And so for example, autistic Christian women are a weird anomaly in this space. So if you look at rates of trans acceptance of men and women, in virtually every demographic, women are more trans accepting than men. And so you look at the rates, and it's sort of like, whoosh, going up over time. But with autistic women, or specifically autistic Christian women, which is why this is an anomaly, is they start in like from 2014, which is when I really started going hard in the data collection, to 2017, the trends are sort of going up in parallel with men being less accepting. And then 2017, it starts to shift and women start dropping. And then by like autistic Christian women, not autistic women, just the Christians, they start getting turf pilled really hard at around 2017. And then by 2020, it's like the autistic Christian men are way more likely to be trans accepting than autistic Christian women.
So that begs the question of how many autistic Christian women were reading Harry Potter when they were younger.
So that was a big moment, but that was in 2020, right? When she dropped that essay.
So that was 3 years before that. Okay.
Yeah, but it's actually a fairly complicated story. It probably has something to do with Brexit.
Wow.
Where so a lot of autistic women, they aren't just like, there's various positions on trans issues on the anti side, and autistic Christian women are like TERFs. So they're trans exclusionary radical feminists, but they are very much radical feminist, or on the radical feminist adjacent side of things. So they come at it very much from a women's perspective, and like a women's rights perspective, and they're very into that. And the intellectual center of that movement comes from the UK. And they basically started to win once Brexit started going into effect, and all of everyone's priorities and issues went from social issues to, oh my God, we need to deal with Brexit, right? And so the turf side of the argument was losing prior to Brexit. If you just look at the information landscape and you look at rates of acceptance and everything, they were losing prior to Brexit. Brexit happens, all of a sudden, there are two sides pushing against each other. One side stops pushing because they have to deal with other things, and then they kind of walk over them. And like, I mean, again, I'm really like at my core an intelligence analyst. I'm not casting moral aspersions on anyone or saying this is good and bad. I'm just saying this is what happened. And so basically they won. And they also got kicked out of the left. So the trans-exclusionary radical feminists are leftists. They are from the left. They are of the left. They're using leftist framing to do their analysis. They get kicked out of the left. Where do they go? They go to Christian podcasts, basically, and other places that don't know what trans stuff is, don't know how to deal with trans stuff, don't, like, completely clueless, kind of taken on the back foot, not really knowing what to do. And then, like, radfems have been dealing with these issues for like 20 years at this point, right? So they are the seasoned warriors in the trenches who know all the talking points. They start showing up on Christian podcasts. Autistic women are very likely to be doing intellectual engagement with their faith, right? That's the primary mode through which autistic people engage with their faith. So they consume a lot of podcasts. And autistic Christian women are specifically way more interested in gender and gender issues than autistic men. And so they just get inundated with this stuff all of a sudden. And they are in places on the internet where they get exposed to these talking points way more than autistic men do. And they just start accepting them at a much faster rate than autistic men. And that starts to happen in 2017. And then it sort of peaks in 2020. And then it basically, it's why there's such a large diversion. But it's like really interesting to note.
Yeah, two questions. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, really interesting to note when you look at how most Christians respond to trans issues and autistic Christians, it's very, very different. Like, you don't hear the same things coming from them. And it's like, it's a really weird thing when you start talking to autistic Christian women, and they're fairly, they'll be on the fairly conservative side, and then you bring up something like women's issues or things like that, and all of a sudden they sound like a second wave radical feminist. They like switch on, and you don't hear a lot of like the Daily Wire, Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro style talking points on trans issues. It's always like radfem stuff, which is very funny. Anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, related to that topic, and that was part of, this guy back here in the blurry background, Surprise to Fame. Like, how does Peterson intersect with the autistic Christian, non-Christian sphere?
Yes, he does. He does a lot, and especially like your corner of the internet. I do data mining. I found you guys quite a while ago. I can't remember exactly when. And I was like, this is a gold mine for autistics. Just like I knew who Michael was well before he even knew, well before I even had a podcast.
Wow, that's nuts. Say more.
Yeah, and so there is a very large intersection, but it's also a very weird intersection, right? Because the way that autistic people think about things and the way that this corner of the internet thinks about things sometimes converge really closely, and sometimes they reason very closely to each other, but sometimes they're like completely at odds. And so you'll have various types of autistic people who come in and engage with this sphere, and some of them get in it and get really into it and then leave after like 2 or 3 years. That's probably the most common thing that happens, is they interact with it for a bit and they get really into it, and then they get frustrated because they just have very different epistemologies and very different ways of thinking and processing things. Like they love data-driven approaches and saying things along the lines like, the rationalist communities. Do you know what I mean when I refer to rationalists?
Dealing with what is rational.
Yeah, so like the Less Wrong, Star Slate's Codex, those sub-communities. Anyway, so autistic people are also wildly into those. Ayla on Twitter, if you know who Ayla is, she's like part of the rationalist sphere. And so autistic people often engage with that sort of like data-driven utilitarian analysis of, okay, this is a math problem that we need to solve, and if we just get the right variables in there, we'll solve it. And this corner of the internet doesn't really do that. To say there's a lot more like
relational ontology.
Yeah. Yeah, relational ontology and holistic analysis, whereas autistic people tend not to be like that. There are still many that do, and the ones that do stay. And so, there's a bit of a survivorship bias effect of autistic people who already think in these ways and already find these things interesting, get embedded in these spaces, and sort of become major figures in it. But the most common thing is for autistic people to go in there, and then after a while, they're like, I just can't work with relational ontology. I can't work with symbology. Like, show me the real thing. What's the data? And so that's usually what the relationship is, and so you get a lot of intersection, basically.
Interesting. So yeah, so when did you feel like you came across something that resembled like an actual thing of this corner of the internet? About what time was?
Ooh, I mean, it's difficult to say. Probably 2018. Probably, but like, I don't think this corner of the internet was really talking about itself that way in 2018.
Yeah.
But like these first sort of inklings of it, I would say, are probably 2018, because that was when the Jordan Peterson sphere started coming up. And I think this corner is a sort of offshoot from those communities. And so a lot of autistic people were really interested in Jordan Peterson just because it was something new and it was something novel.
Yep.
And then a lot of them broke off and joined these other different communities and sub-communities around it. And so probably around 2018 is when I started to see them coalescing. But really not until like 2021, 2022 is when it really started to take off, and really started to better self-define, I would say. But yeah, that's kind of that. I use Paul Vanderklay a lot as like a data mining source. So
Wow.
So finding people that interacted with him a lot, you use like people. So the term that you typically use is like watering hole. So it's like an account that people typically interact with of a certain disposition, and you find like autistic people are often interacting with these communities and joining these communities. And so oftentimes you could like find a single figure and just look at their interactions and then like go through the interactions and be like, okay, this guy is interacting in a post 3 years ago. He said, just got diagnosed with autism. And it's like, great, gonna scrape all those posts, read what you have to say, hear what you have to hear about Christianity and why you're coming to it, or why you're converting, or why you deconverted, and why you're now interacting with these things. And then usually I'll reach out to them and be like, hey, want to do an interview? But yeah, that's basically how it goes.
Wow. That's so fascinating, because I mean, you coming at that from a very data mined data set, looking at these things kind of objectively. I've seen like different graphs, or I don't know what they're called, but they're, these networked effects, like here's a character, and then these people are connected to those guys, and all the network effects and stuff. So I mean,
so I have those, but for autistic people. Yeah,
that's really interesting. So what is, you've gotten a lot of feedback. You said you've been going since September. You did 10 episodes initially.
Yeah, so the sort of the bulk of my research of what I wanted to get out there was 10 episodes, and then since then I've just been launching sporadic Q&A episodes to answer questions that people send me.
When do you do those?
When do I do them?
Yeah.
Usually I just drop an episode on Sundays.
And you're answering questions. You're not doing live Q&As. You're taking things from
No, I basically I just collect questions in a spreadsheet, and whenever I get enough questions or I think the topic is interesting, I'll just do an episode where I try to address all the questions that I've been getting.
What have been some of the most salient, or some of the most like intriguing that you've
everyone wanted to know about gender stuff. Everyone wanted to know about gender and sexuality and like
related to autism and Christianity.
Yes. Yeah. So I got an enormous amount of questions about that. So there are a lot of trans autistics, and there are a lot of TERF autistics, and they both wanted to know about trans issues, but for different reasons. And so that's probably the one I got the most questions about, but also like probably the most stressful one to do, because just trying to walk that line of objectivity in a very heated culture war is incredibly difficult to do. And like, if you listen to the episode, I start off with like 20 minutes of caveats of me saying, look, guys, I'm just trying to describe what I've seen and what I've noticed. I'm not saying these are good positions to hold. I'm just saying these are the positions that people hold. And so I go over, like, what do trans autistic people think about gender and relations to gender and sexuality? Like, how do they define sex? And what are the various different ways that autistic Christians define sex and think about sex, as in, like, sex and gender? And then what are their relationships to non-binary identities? Like, do they think they are useful and valid? Do they think they're useless? Do they have like a very complicated relationship with them because they're gender non-conforming women who are very much women and don't like being called non-binary because they're just like, I'm just a tomboy, but I'm still a woman. Stop calling me non-binary. Like, they're all, you have the whole spectrum in there. And so, yeah, it was a very stressful set of episodes to do. And just talking about, like, a lot of autistic people, most people don't talk about this. A lot of autistic people have gender dysphoria in their teens that goes away after the puberty stops. Don't know why. I just know that it happens and it's a thing. It happened with me. Like, I didn't realize that this was an experience that was not unique to me until I started talking to a lot of other autistic men, and they're like, "Oh yeah, of course I had that." That's and oftentimes we don't, like, I didn't even know gender dysphoria was a thing. I just thought this was something that everyone had to deal with going through puberty, because in evangelical subculture, people talk about, you're going to have these feelings show up in puberty, and they're talking about lust, and I thought they were talking about gender dysphoria. And I was like, oh yeah, this is a normal part of puberty that everyone's dealing with. And then realizing, I remember, like, I was like 19 or 20, and I was talking about, like, oh yeah, like, puberty is so weird, you got gender dysphoria, and they're like, what? No, you don't. I was like, oh yeah, that was totally a joke. Yeah, that's a great joke. And then I'm going, oh, so this isn't a common experience that everyone has. But just talking about things like that, talking about those types of things, very, very difficult to do. Obviously, people don't like talking about those types of things. And there's a sort of trend on more right-wing spaces to use autism as a sort of cudgel to beat trans people with, and I'm not interested in doing that. It's just, I don't know. I don't think it is helpful to either trans people or autistic people to do that. And I think you need to approach these conversations with grace and understanding and an acceptance that this is actually way more complicated than you probably think it is. And a lot of times people are looking to fight a culture war, not looking to honestly answer these questions with the complexity that they deserve and the nuance they deserve. And so, walking that tightrope was really hard. And yeah, I recently did a few episodes about high control religions and fundamentalism within autism. Like, a lot of autistic people go through a cult phase, where especially when they're younger, they'll get involved with cults and, like, religious cults and extremely high control, abusive, toxic religion. And I just go through explaining why that happens and why they do that and why they get involved with those and why there are so many autistic people who get caught up in these places and in these spaces. And so also talk about a lot of things like that. And then, people also have questions about how I did my research methodology, how I do data scraping, how I do attribution, all that stuff. So I did an episode on that. If you're really into the math and data science behind my research, you can check that out. But yeah, that's sort of the bulk of my questions that I get, and where they're centered around.
Have any pastors reached out?
Yeah, a lot of autistic pastors have reached out to be like, wow, I didn't realize I was autistic until I listened to your podcast, because I had a child with autism in my congregation, and I Googled autism and Christianity, and I found your podcast.
Oh, wow.
And then they're like, and then I started going through and I realized I probably might be autistic. But yeah, a lot of pastors and priests who aren't autistic will also just reach out to ask what can I do better? How can I accommodate autistic people? What sorts of things do I need to do to make my church better and more welcoming to autistic people? Like, or all of a sudden, all these autistic people are showing up at my church, and what's going on? Like, why is that happening? Especially like a lot of priests in Catholic and Orthodox parishes are seeing like an influx of young autistic men showing up to their church, and they're like, "What do I do? How
Do you
do I deal
attribute
with
that
these people?"
to this pipeline here a little bit? Like
It is likely so that's part of the feeder pipeline for sure. Like I would say that's probably like 60% of the feeder pipeline.
wow, 60%.
Likely, yeah. And like not just like this corner of the internet, but all the related fields and subfields. So we're just like
Yeah.
getting into Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson says go to church, and so you go to whatever church is closest to you. And now the priest is like, okay, I have this guy who clearly has like a social disability and who is clearly dealing with some stuff. What do I do? and so I'm fielding a lot of these questions and pointing people towards my podcast to be like, this guy's probably not going to be normal. There's going to be some weird stuff that you're going to have to deal with, and they may not understand what you're saying or how you're saying it. And this is how you better communicate with them. This is what you need to understand.
Do you know about Paul's Estuary project?
I do, yes.
Do you think that is a beneficial way for autistic people to interact with their faith in a type of way through a conversation protocol?
Yeah, so it's effective for some people, but one of the things that I say with autism is the phrase NSB, so no silver bullets.
Yeah.
It's something that we hear a lot in software engineering, and something we use a lot in the tech space. It's just basically there's no one size fits all solution for autism. Autism is very complex. You have people on both sides of a polarized dyad, so like you'll have hypo emotional and hyper emotional. And you need to deal with those very differently from each other. You have hypersensitive and hyposensitive. Those need to be dealt with, differently.
Like with sound, sometimes can be very intense.
Yep. And just like how well they respond to criticism and directness. Some of them need you to be direct. Like you basically need to say to their face, "Hey, sort yourself out. This is what you're doing now." And like I used to mentor a lot of young autistic men, and I would get sent the ones that you need to be very direct with and to their face. And I was very good at that because like my Army officer background, very direct, very confrontational. This is what you're doing wrong. This is what you need to do right. This is how you do it. Here's the plan. Execute now. Some autistic people, however, respond extremely poorly to that, to put it lightly, and they take any sort of direct confrontation as a personal attack, and it makes them feel really bad, and they have low self-esteem, and like they don't do well with that. And some of us will be very direct with you and like very blunt and very upfront, and some of them will hold back and not be blunt at all and not be critical, and will just take what you say and then secretly go back and be like, I didn't like this and I didn't agree with it at all. But you won't be able to tell that's what they're thinking because of the way that they're socialized to respond to critique and criticism and how to deal with disagreement and things like that. And so I'd love for there to be a one size fits all solution, but there kind of isn't. And you sort of just have to understand what autism is. And now that you understand what autism is, go forward, kind of throw spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks, and be very willing to accept when it doesn't stick. And yeah, just course correct, adjust. And basically the easiest thing you can do and the best thing you can do is just learn about autism and learn how it interacts with Christianity.
Well, it sounds like there's a really good resource for that out there.
Yes. Yeah. If only some guy did 10 years of data science research to collect and correlate all these findings. If only.
This has been such a insightful and wildly fascinating and intersecting conversation. Was there anything, when you put out that all call on X to be like, hey, I'm interested in starting to try to go on to some
Yeah.
podcasts. Like, was there anything that we haven't talked about that you were hoping to be able to share related to wanting to get out more?
No, I think we touched on everything basically. That's I just wanted more people to know that this project exists, mostly because I've been getting a lot of really good feedback from autistic people who are like, where has this been all my life?
Wow.
Thank you for making it. And so I was just like, you know, if one additional autistic person hears about this, mission accomplished. Great. And if they benefit from it, amazing. Awesome. And so yeah.
This really also makes me think, and this is a whole nother conversation, but this really also makes me think about the contrast between what AI can do and what, like, you know, everything that you've been using, but also to the part about the relational, the relating to, you know, that the corner might not, with all the relating or thinky talky relating, but what you're doing is relating to, like, you're creating a relational ontology for autistic people.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's extremely powerful. And that can only happen. It should be only happening from a human. And I think that that's incredibly wonderful. I'm excited to share this, man. I'm so yeah, this is awesome.
Sort of on that topic, are you familiar with Martin Buber and like I thou relationships?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, so Martin Buber was a Jewish philosopher in the mid 20th century, very influential in the way that I think about relationships and relationality. He wrote this very influential book that went on to affect how Christian theology was done for, like, basically since the 1950s, called I and Thou.
Mm-hmm.
And in I and Thou, he specifies that there are two types of relationships that we have with other people and other things. An I-it relationship, which is your relation to a subject through basically an analytical lens. So you have an I-it relationship with, like, this cup or something, where my relationship to this cup is defined solely in terms of its physical attributes and the things that it does and how it functions and how it relates to me. But then there is another type of relationship called I and Thou, which is a relationship that sort of defines the specific bounds of objective analysis. And a lot of what you guys are doing on this corner of the internet is I-thou relationality, or trying to get at and point at I-thou relationality and encourage other people to go into that I-thou relationality. And what I found is a lot of autistic people really struggle with understanding I-thou as typically understood. And I often describe what I'm doing as trying to establish an ontological autistic thou, where you are moving to that relationship with another person where you are no longer engaging in that relationship in terms of objective metrics and, like, crunching numbers and just analyzing what they're saying, and you're moving to a level beyond where you are appreciating that person in this sort of higher level intersubjective way. And I'm trying to basically do that for autism. Yeah. And so I often describe myself as trying to reimagine an autistic thou. And I mean, I'm really bad at theology, so I'm not very good at that. That's sort of one of the side projects and the things that I'm attempting to do.
So helping John create an autistic corner of the internet.
Yes.
Have you thought about doing live group stuff, kind of like what Paul does? He's on Fridays sometimes, is like he'll talk about a subject and then he's a StreamYard, and then people can come up and kind of hang out, you know, maybe discuss, or I don't know, and hopefully get, you know, an autistic group to engage.
I have thought about doing that. I have not had the time to think through the logistics or how I'd want to do it or when I'd want to do it. It's definitely one of the things on my to-do list. I started an autistic Discord, which is sort of focusing on that. It's just a Discord for autistic Christians to hang out. And we talk about all sorts of things. And it's, you know, it's also, we have ex-Christians in there who just like talking about Christianity and things like that. So that's currently what we have, but I would like to do more of a public thing. It's just getting the right people in those
Yep.
conversations. And
Yeah.
again, autistic people can be kind of a mixed bag of extremes on one end or another. And sometimes, like, you'll get far right autistics and far left autistics, both Christian, both arguing about each other, and both really think they're right. And very hard to get them to stop arguing with each other. And it's something I'm extremely used to doing, but it's like there are levels of additional complication that come in when you have two people who both have a social communication set of issues,
Sure.
who are now very passionate, very intense, and now butting heads. Yes, and now they're interlocked in the story of, you know, the unstoppable force meets immovable object, but you know, now with autism.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, John, this has been awesome, man. Like I said, this has been wildly fascinating for me and encouraging in a lot of ways. And I very much so look forward to sharing this with people that pay attention to what I'm doing, and hopefully it will reach other people. There's autistic people paying attention, that this can connect with and just in the great web that we already discussed of the web, you know, the network effects and all the things, that this can be a good thing for some people. So thanks for joining me today, man.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for taking time out of your day to talk. It's been great.
Yeah, it has been. All right, man. We'll finish this up backstage.
Sounds good.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.